So again, thank you, panelists, for coming. I want to start with an overarching question that I'm hoping that the three of you can help us answer. And this will be kind of the question for the entire night. How would you define a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world? And do these words thriving, prosperous, and abundant mean different things, or are they synonymous? To begin the conversation, let me ask each of you a more specific question. I want to start with Alec. In producing promotional materials, as I noted, I inadvertently stole one of your organization's taglines, progress is a policy choice. Didn't even realize it wasn't my own words. Can you explain how the Institute for Progress is helping us make better policy choices and thereby creating a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world?
Well, I'm glad you stole it. I'm glad it's catching on. I also make an admission here that we actually stole it a little bit as well. Connor Sen, who's a columnist for Bloomberg, he became somewhat well known for a phrase, the future is a policy choice, which I think is also correct. But as policy think tank in DC, we really focus on the policy being the key lever for progress. And so, so how do we actually improve policy in DC? How do we use that lever? Well, as an innovation policy think tank, if you guys are aware of our work, you're probably aware of maybe one of our substacks like statecraft, construction physics, factory settings, macro science. Maybe you've read one of our white papers or seen one of our op-eds. So maybe have seen our public-facing work. But actually, a majority of what the Institute for Progress does in Washington, D.C. is behind the scenes. Because our North Star as an organization, our mission is to achieve counterfactual policy impact, meaning is policy different in Washington, D.C. because of our organization's efforts? And in our experience and from our perspective, most of that work actually happens behind the scenes, working very closely with people in Congress or in the executive branch. You have to identify champions, build coalitions and consensus within government for change. A lot of that is like in-person meetings, going to happy hours, getting in the right group chats, right signal groups, you might say in DC, and really persuading people over time that you have the answer to their problems. And so most of that work, again, is behind the scenes, and it's helping them figure out what analysis do you need as a decision maker to move the ball forward, and we do that. So to give one concrete example of this, we worked a lot on the National Science Foundation's new Tech Labs initiative. This is a 5-year, $1 billion pilot program where the National Science Foundation is really testing the idea of moving partially away from incremental small grants to individual PIs at universities. Right now, the vast majority of their funding, that's the model they use. There's a lot of people in the meta science community that believe we'll get much better breakthrough research if we support teams of scientists engaged in interdisciplinary research, potentially in new institutions of science. But they need much larger amounts of money for multiple years at a time. And so this $1 billion program is going to support teams for up to 7 years, $10 to $50 million a year, and there's a lot more flexibility for that money. But to get this like major reform, this is like potentially the biggest reform in US science policy in decades, our meta science team at IFP had to build consensus across the White House, people in the Deputy Chief of Staff office, the National Science Foundation itself and their career civil servants, as well as the relevant congressional committees that oversee our science funding agencies. And so that took about 12 months, which, as you guys know, in DC time is lightning fast to build consensus. And a majority of that work happened behind the scenes. It's preparing the right memo for the right meeting and helping them communicate with each other. And so we only do US federal policy. We spend all of our time. That's enough for us. Other folks do great state policy work or international policy work. But that's where we think what we mean by policy is progress as a policy choice. Yeah.
Thank you, Alec. Liza, last week it was reported by the New York Times, quote, President Trump announced he was erasing the scientific finding that climate change endangers human health and the environment, ending the federal government's legal authority to control the pollution that is dangerously heating the planet, end quote. Your research and commentary has been on the needs to improve America's electricity grid and our clean energy infrastructure. Why is this infrastructure needed to create a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world? And to what extent does President Trump's actions thwart that progress?
Can I just talk about my organization?
Please. Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I'm teasing.
We give you the hard ones for a reason, Liza.
We are diving right in, and I'm happy to. No, I think this is a really good and important question, Mark, and I thank you for it. Because, you know, when we think about what is thriving, what is prosperous, what is abundant, one of the things is energy, right? And if we look at throughout human history, but in particular, since we've actually been recording data, so we know that energy access, energy use is correlated with growth, is correlated with GDP, is correlated with better health outcomes, right? So we know that this correlation is there, but then we also know that there's causation there. So the World Bank has done analysis on electricity specifically and how increases in electricity access have led to measurable improvements in income and in productivity in various countries across the globe, right? So we already know that energy is part of being thriving and prosperous, right? If you think about growth, if you think about income, if you think about health, like to me, all of that is part of thriving and prosperous, and so we need this energy. But the only way to get that energy is through infrastructure. So one of the things you mentioned is the electric grid, and this is what I did my PhD research on, and it is one of the pillars of our team at Climate and Energy at Niskanen Center, is expanding the capacity of the electricity grid, and particularly looking at the regulations that are making it difficult, and figuring out how we can change those or introduce new mechanisms for building electricity transmission. I could spend this entire panel talking about how you build transmission and why it is hard, but the short answer is electricity was always local, but that's not true anymore, right? We can move power long distances, and we should be moving power long distances because that increases your choices for power. That increases your ability to get power from all over the country, including places that don't have different weather impacts, right? So when you have a heat wave, when you have a winter storm, you can get power from places that are not impacted by that. And every single type of generation is impacted by heat waves, is impacted by storms, right? So you need this infrastructure to get that energy access and to get that growth, right? So we need this transmission capacity so that we can have this additional growth that we need. And we need it to be clean for a couple of reasons. One of them is the market access, right? When you have more choices, your prices are going down, right? Costs are lower for consumers when there is more energy in the market and more different kinds of energy in the market, right? That is just simply how competition works. And then we also need clean energy because climate change is happening, right? And this brings us to the endangerment finding. And one of the things that I think is really important is despite what was announced by the president, what was done in the actual repealment is not a repeal of the scientific findings. So from the government's perspective right now, the scientific findings that greenhouse gas emissions are impacting human health and human prosperity is both scientific fact and it is the government's perspective on the science, right? It is a legal repeal that they did in the endangerment finding. But that still does have impacts, right? This legal repeal does mean that the federal government's position is that they do not have the legal authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Now in Niskanen, our preferred mechanism for regulating greenhouse gas emissions is a market mechanism, right? It is the most efficient, right? It establishes a carbon price, right, that puts the pressure where it should be, which is on the externalities, right, on the emissions themselves instead of creating all these regulatory rules. But there is value in having complementary policies on regulation that could happen through something like an endangerment finding and something like vehicle emissions policies, right? Carbon pricing can move the economy on the whole, but there are still consumer impacts and consumer choices that economists have found you really do need things like efficiency standards to move forward. So it's kind of part of a whole picture. So what does the endangerment finding repeal mean for this growth and prosperity? It means a lot of confusion, right? And it means a lot of cost. Because I think what we're going to find is that it doesn't end here. And I don't just mean lawsuits. I mean, states are going to find ways to try to be regulating these as well. And so now we have a patchwork of systems, right? That's more complicated. That's more expensive for businesses. That's more cost on consumers. And that's less innovation because you're so busy working on compliance now, you're not able to focus on your growth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Turn it over to Sara. I'm noticing that I asked a first question that was kind of about your institution, and Sara, I'm going to ask about your institution, and I forgot to ask Liza about yours. So, Sara, the Volcker Alliance has as part of its mission, quote, to promote innovation in public service education, empower rising leaders to build the democracy of our future, and connect talent to city, state, and federal government jobs. And your work, quote, focuses on the people at the core of government service delivery, people who provide a steadfast source of optimism during an unsettled time for our democracy. Can you explain the concept of state capacity which is a concept that is out there, and I want to see if you could explain it to us, and why improving state capacity is necessary to create a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world. And if I could add a question I didn't prepare you for, which I noticed that the word in here is source of optimism. Why is optimism in the civil in our civil services? Why is that important?
Okay, I'm gonna get to all of that. Before I go directly to your question, I have a question. Does everyone know who, and it's okay if you don't, Paul Volcker was? Okay, some people don't, right? So he's the founder of our organization. So I'm just gonna give him a shout out because he's also a good stage setter for this conversation. For those of you who don't know him, he worked in public service for more than 30 years. He's probably most well known for his time as chair of the Federal Reserve under both Carter and Reagan. At the end of his career, after he spent some time in the private sector, he was asked by President Obama to chair the president's Economic Recovery Advisory Board following 2008 and all the economic upheaval then. And when he was appointed chair of the Federal Reserve, it was an extremely inflationary time for the country, right? I mean, it would make today look like nothing. And one of the things that he did notoriously was raise the interest rates, raise them in an effort to break the back of inflation. And they got as high as 22%, right? So what we're talking today, we think 6 is high, 7 is high, 22% was high. And he did that because that was a long game decision, a policy choice around making a decision for the many that might in the shorter term disadvantage the few. And many credit him for the prosperity, that's a word on your board, that I think we've had for decades in this country. And so he's a nice stage setter. I'm going to come back to that. But to your question about state capacity, I'm going to answer it in 2 buckets. And I think I'm going to get to optimism as we go through. A little footnote.
Sounds good.
The first bucket is the ability of public servants or government, which is made up of people. Government is comprised of people to deliver, right? That's sort of a state capacity concept. And the second is public service values as state capacity, that you need these to create a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world. And I'm going to just talk about each of those quickly. So first, about public servants and their ability to deliver. When you think about government, sometimes you think about a risk-averse mindset, right? Like, why should we not do that? What should we think about? What do you need to do before we're going to consider your proposal? Slowness, right? Like not the opposite of nimbleness. And I think the state capacity issue is government is incredibly important and powerful and influential and can do all kinds of things to create change. But in order to do that, we have to help get to a mindset of yes. How do we get to yes, as opposed to how do we worry about how to stop things from happening? And some of that is really sort of the thick and accumulated bureaucracy that we sometimes associate with government, that it's hard for public servants to move, right? And in doing their jobs well, they are often hamstrung by lots of different steps in a process. So when we think about state capacity, we think a little bit about unleashing the innovative capacity of people in government, having them move more nimbly, innovatively, quickly. And that's not to say that we don't need regulation. I think you talked about that at the beginning of your remarks. Of course we need regulation, but we need government to regulate where the market doesn't do a good job of it and where the incentives aren't there. But we also need government to be able to experiment and to be able to try and invest in new things. And so when you think about Operation Warp Speed, we all went through COVID, and the idea that we in 10 months were able to help accelerate the production of a vaccine that literally saved billions of lives and brought us to a different place. Government did that, but it did that also by relaxing some of the constraints around the people within it to get us to do something big. So state capacity, I think, also in this context is really important to optimism, because when you think about future leaders and you have a view of government as being sclerotic and unable to engage, unable to drive forward, it doesn't really feel like an interesting place to want to go work, right? But what we really need, and this is something Mr. Volcker felt very strongly about and what we work to do, is we need people who have all different disciplines and all different talents and who are capable and expert in their craft to come and be a part of government and to look at it as a vehicle of change and progress. So I think, you want to be able to say, wow, I could go work there and there's no better way for me to contribute. So that's one bucket in response to your question. And the second, and I think this brings us a little bit also to today, which is that and it's foundational. It's hard to have a thriving, prosperous, abundant world without public service values. And that is to me, it can mean a lot of things, but it's a steadfast commitment to common good, right? To collective good. So you can't achieve an abundance agenda when the government is kind of loyal to select actors, or when it acts on whims, right? Or when I sometimes like to think that partisanism and tribalism, that is the opposite of abundance or abundance culture. And I'm just going to give you a recent example from the news. And I am agnostic as to what is right about this example. I'm just going to use it to illustrate. But have you heard of the Gordie Howe Bridge project? Anyone? Historically, there's been one bridge that connects Detroit to Canada, Windsor, Ontario. And it's been and there's a family that owns it. A second bridge has been in the works for years, right? Building a second bridge with more lanes, more pedestrian lanes, car lanes, bike lanes, and an ability to move goods more fluidly across the border, right? Just more. I don't know. I'm sure there are many, many reasons not to have a second bridge, but that's not the point of the story. The Detroit family that owns the one bridge likes being in a solo gig, right? Like that is a beneficial position for this family to be in. And with this new administration, placed a call, this is all reported in the news, call to the Commerce Secretary calls the president, lo and behold, there's a stall on the second bridge project. And I guess the question is, how can you be optimistic in that context? You can't accomplish an abundance agenda if the prevailing culture in government is to leverage the power to enrich some. And again, I'm not saying that it's right to build two bridges, that's de facto right. But what has been historically the practice is to weigh the costs and the benefits of an addition like this in a way that involves expertise and evidence and objectivity. I have no idea if it's a good idea to build a bridge, but I wish that we would discuss it. And at the Alliance, we think of this as a critical part of state capacity. It's acute emergency kind of cultural crisis because we need government leaders who are grounded in public service values. And that's part of what, when you come to a school like this, you learn that it's not easy you can't make everybody happy. You're not necessarily going to be able to do that. You're going to have to compromise. You're going to have to make choices. You're going to have to choose to progress. But to do that, we have to be committed, I think, to progress and to thinking about ways that we do that. And it's not a zero-sum game.
Thank you. Next question, before we get past this definition of abundance, it's important to recognize that we're talking about this in part today because of the book Abundance that came out a year ago, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. That book, Alec and I were talking beforehand, it did better than people expected it to do. And it's, I would say, shaped a lot of the narrative around abundance, but the idea of abundance had been around for a much longer period of time. So maybe, Alec, if you could handle this question, to what extent do you think the book captured the abundance idea correctly? And do you think that it misshaped the narrative about abundance in any way?
Yes, I think abundance ideas in terms of supply side reforms, how do you increase the supply side of the economy in terms of housing, energy infrastructure, transportation, healthcare. This has been policy reform efforts for decades. You can think of like general deregulatory efforts as being abundance oriented. So Republicans in the center right would say, we've been pro-abundance for decades, like nice of some Democrats like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson to catch up. the Niskanen Center, which actually was one of my first jobs in DC. I worked at the Niskanen Center. I think we didn't overlap, did we, Liza? I worked before you. And Niskanen Center was known for all these ideas in terms of promoting an idea around cost disease socialism. The idea being that government policy often results in cost disease, meaning inflation, because you end up subsidizing a fixed supply. And so when you give people more money to compete over the same number of goods, obviously the cost of those goods go up. And that's mainly what recent administrations have been trying to do to increase access and affordability. And it's obviously counterproductive. But I think the big change for abundance was popularizing these ideas around some deregulatory efforts and a lot of ideas to increase the supply side of the economy and making it okay to be a Democrat who supports these ideas. And I think we see it directly in our work, working with, for example, Democratic staffers in Congress right now. A lot of them are saying, hey, yeah, maybe I do support reforms to environmental review now because I read about the problems this creates for building solar and wind infrastructure and transmission lines in the book Abundance. And before, if you roll the clock back to just even the last Congress, they would have said, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that's the Magna Carta of environmental law. Like, as Democrats, our position as a party is no one can touch this law other than maybe to strengthen it, but you can't do any reforms that could potentially be perceived as weakening it. And now the door is much wider open, and it's a cause for debate within the Democratic Party. The challenge for us, as we're a bipartisan organization, is that now because of negative polarization in DC, Republicans are a little hesitant to work on these ideas because abundance is coded as a center-left thing. And so one quick example on this is there's a caucus within Congress where generally caucuses, these are groups of members who agree to, in general, work together on a certain topic. There was a push at the beginning of this Congress to create an abundance caucus. The goal was to be bipartisan, so it can increase the odds that we actually pass reforms and pass legislation to improve abundance in the United States. But the Republican members balked at calling it an abundance caucus. So it's unofficially an abundance caucus, but now it is the Build America caucus. It exists, it's a thing. It's a mix of Republicans and Democrats, slightly more Democrats than Republicans. They all actually care about abundance, but for public perception, they had to call it the Build America Caucus, which is fine, but it tells you that that term, the book became so popular, and Ezra and Derek are so deeply associated with being center-left figures that it's made the bipartisan work a little harder.
Thank you. Liza, I'm going to turn to you on this next question, which is, at the front end of this discussion, I gave a list of 7 important topics, or what I believe to be 7 important things for creating abundance: education, innovation, raising savings rates, free trade, immigration, limited sensible regulation, and seeking to minimize market distortions. Are there other things not on that list that the Niskanen Center would support that I'm missing, or any that your center or that you personally would disagree with?
I think that's a great list, but I would add energy.
I'm sorry?
I would add energy,
Yep.
right? I mean, I already gave my energy talk, but I'll say it again. Energy is growth, right? Energy is how we ensure that we can actually achieve abundance across all of those vectors because we need more energy. And I think one of the things that connects across them, which is a thread for Niskanen, is choices. Right? Is that, and this is when we think about markets, we use the term markets a lot, but one part of what makes markets so effective is that you have choice, right? And so when I think about, energy diversity, right? You are bringing more choice. I don't want to speak for too much for our other policy departments because I will get it wrong, but, when the work that we do in employment policy and the work that we do, housing policy, obviously it's more houses, more choices, but part of employment policy is about unemployment insurance, because knowing that you have support between jobs gives you more choices for changing your job, right? You are not stuck. You are not feeling stuck where you are in your moment. You can seek that prosperity because there is some social safety net there to catch you. And I think that's an important thread throughout, is how do we enable choices and make it possible, not just that choices exist, but that people can choose. Right. And that is, again, as I said, it's part of sort of our social safety network, but certainly part of energy, right? How do we get more energy in the system? How do we allow people more access to things? And then the last one I'll throw in, because we've been playing around with it a little bit, and we'll have a piece on it next week. It wasn't published in time for this panel, is the environment. But instead of the environment, I'll say habitats, because the environment sort of gives its own terminology and sense to when we think about, what do words mean and who associates themselves with them. All of this growth, and one of the critiques that came out of the sort of abundance book and the abundance discourse in the democratic circles for the most part was about environmental impacts, right? And Alec mentioned this with permitting as well. When we are thinking about growth, what does that mean about habitats? And I think one thing that gets lost in the way that we've all learned about sort of the environment and impacts in the environment. I have 2 children. I have a 6-year-old and a 1-year-old, so I read a lot of children's books. And children's books really simplify narratives. And one of the narratives that they often simplify is that building things is cutting down trees. Right? That is the correlation, that infrastructure is a problem and green things are good. But we actually not just plant trees, we rebuild habitats all the time, right? Our country is actually incredibly good at this, at rebuilding ecosystems, at rescuing species. And so the idea that, there's a flavor of abundance for everything. I think Steve Tellis, one of our senior fellows, was on your first panel and has a rainbow of abundance. There's red abundance and there's cascading abundance. There's all these different things because everyone can turn abundance into everything. But I think habitat abundance is actually something that is important to start thinking about, because we can have supply side ecosystems too. And that ties in to all of the factors that you were talking about, right? It ties into prosperity. It ties into how people enjoy their natural world, but it doesn't have to be in tension or in conflict with infrastructure growth.
You may know this, but tell me if I'm wrong. I believe we have more forest land in the United States than we used to. Anybody know this is true?
Let's say yes.
Okay, let's
That
say
sounds
yes.
great.
So that sounds consistent with what you're saying. I want to talk about the positive side, and I'll throw it to any of you, but possibly Sarah, you can start us out. I want to start with, what are we doing right now that we should acknowledge that is generating abundance? Because so often government gets focused on what it's not doing, what it's doing poorly. But if you think about what you see in the world right now, what are the things you're happy to see that we're doing? And that could be the US, but it could also be in an international context.
I actually do think this comes through in the book that we are an innovative people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the best things that we could do come from trying lots of different things. And so there are innumerable challenges. We've talked about a number of them. There's a number that we haven't talked about, but there is interest, and I think it is, very much so a multi-generational interest, but also an interest of our rising leaders and a lot of the people in this room to think about the kinds of changes that are transformational, right? And to not be trapped in our current situation, but to continue to build new future. And I think that energy is an example of that in its best form. I don't know that we've found the best policy ways here necessarily to incentivize that kind of innovation. And sometimes the innovation in this country comes from the private sector a little bit more than it does the public, but the public can do it. And I think that that's an ethos and something that we can bring forward. And so I am optimistic about our ability to solve problems when we bring lots of discipline and interest and commitment to doing so.
I would maybe just add that I think this is a somewhat more controversial issue. Prescription drugs, right? So the Biden administration, for the first time, they passed a new law saying that Medicare could negotiate the prices in bulk buying for 10 prescription drugs. And now I believe that's being implemented in some version by the Trump administration. So people don't like paying a lot for prescription drugs, obviously. Consumers don't like high prices. But the thing that the US has been doing for decades is we are carrying all of global biomedical innovation on our backs. Like no one else is creating the market to sell drugs that justifies the billion-dollar investments that pharmaceutical companies and biomedical startups make in inventing the next cancer treatment, the next vaccine, the next therapy. Cell and gene therapies are a big market now. And so I think like this is an industry that literally would not exist without the US market being a target. And the best example of this, and this has historically been a US strength, we deserve a lot of credit for biomedical innovation around the world, but it is at risk. And so you might have seen in the news recently that the FDA at first decided to change its mind on reviewing a phase 3 trial from Moderna, the biomedical company that made the mRNA COVID vaccine. They're now doing COVID vaccines for they're doing mRNA vaccines for all sorts of other diseases, including a flu vaccine. They had agreement on a study, on design, a methodology for their phase 3 trial. They had agreement with the FDA to review it. And then the new leadership at FDA at the last minute said, your methodology is too weak. We're not going to review your study. And that was a very political decision. There was such a backlash within the first 48 hours that FDA leadership had to reverse their position. But why was there a backlash? It wasn't just a backlash from Moderna, who said, like, we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in these clinical trials for this vaccine. It was because the entire biomedical industry around the world said, we cannot invest in new drugs and treatments if the FDA is going to change its mind at the last minute and destroy the entire value of those investments. And so we can have a lot of big debates around like how to pay for drugs, how to make sure that we're incentivizing innovation without costs being too high for patients. At the end of the day, it's something we should be very proud of as Americans, that most biomedical innovation in the world is due to our market and our investments.
I might add to that there's also a freedom of speech aspect to that, which is that we have the ability to petition our government. And so that petitioning of government is to say, change your decision, and they responded. Liza, other ways in which you see that we are being successful in generating abundance?
So one of the things that I think is really wonderful about the structure in the United States is this federalism approach that we have, right, where you have a federal role and you have a state role. And in the book, right, and in the discourse, this also causes problems, right, because there's aspects of this where you can have federal rules and state rules, right, and now you have two sets of procedures to go through. But overall, that idea and that structure and the way we think about where decisions get made, I think really ties into state capacity, right? It sort of has imbued all of us through our own civics discourse with an understanding at its core about who gets to make decisions, so that when we think about rebuilding state capacity, we already have this core understanding of growth, abundance, prosperity, right? All of this is about structures as well, right? And not over-regulating and not over-structuring, but making sure that decisions get made where they need to get made. And I think having that as sort of a core underlying aspect of our entire Constitution, and at the risk of sounding incredibly dramatic in such a conclusion, I actually do think it's an important part of this abundant future that we're building.
Okay, now I'm going to switch to the negative. So I want to talk about the ways in which our policies at the local, state, federal levels are thwarting abundance. And Sara, I'm going to ask you first. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about some things that you hit on earlier, which is policy consistency, predictability, and you talked about churn and things moving quickly. Can you talk a little bit more about how those lack of policy consistency thwarts abundance, but also high rates of displacement and churn within the federal workforce, how that helps or hinders abundance?
Yeah, we've had a colossal change in the way federal workforce is structured over the past year, and so much has happened. It's hard to remember, but there was a time when DOGE was big in the news, right? And there was a theory that government's too big and we have to get rid of all of these people who work within it. And the federal workforce was downsized, more than 300,000 people in a year, and so that churn came in a very big way. And that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of room to think about ways for government to be more efficient. And there wasn't lots of ways to think about how to unleash some of the potential of government through smaller people, smaller staff size, through AI, through different kinds of innovation. But, I really think we lost more than just jobs. And that's something that we're talking a lot about at the Alliance, because when you think about working in government, not just the potential for it, but it had been a pretty consistent and safe career, right? Like you could build a future, a retirement, you could have some security. And when you see sort of the way that it really, the upheaval and the retirement of many, many young people. So one of the things that came through in the federal workforce downsizing this past year is a lot of the probationary employees were let go. Probationary employees are typically the youngest, not to be ageist, but the least mature in the workforce. And we had the federal government has very, very few young people in government, or what we would call sort of early career folks within under the age of 30, as compared to the private sector. There was already very few. And with this upheaval, you start to it doesn't look like a very attractive place to be. That's something that we were talking about, because we've been talking about it for a long time, but it came at the Volcker Alliance, but it came to the forefront very, very starkly over the last year. And I think that it is multi-generational teams are the best kind of teams. And when I think about why, and that's in government, in the private sector, and anywhere, you need people with experience and know the ropes and know how to move through the political infrastructure and know how to, and I'm talking mainly about the federal government, this is also true in the state, and people who have seasoned, know how to start a program in the right time, in the right way, and also know how to analyze things, know where to move. And you also need people who come in with a different kind of fluency. And folks who are early in their career, who are recent graduates, who are, within 10 years, I think, of graduation, the technological fluency is profound. And when you start to match that technological fluency and just sort of the new, what the next generation grows with, and the experience, you wind up with, I think, a potential to do a lot of things. And in this churn, we've kind of lost both. So we have to think about how to recapture some of the expertise that has been kind of pushed to the side in favor of more partisan, movement, political decision making, in favor of sort of nonpartisan, dispassionate expertise, and encouraging future leaders to think about what they can bring to the conversation, to the policy discussion, and to the creation of it. So I think we really have been set back a little bit on both fronts, and we're going to need to do some work in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Can I just build on that really quick? Because I'm getting flashbacks to 12 months ago, a little PTSD on like the early Doge cuts. And their theory of the case was that the government is just too large. There are too many bureaucrats. We're going to cut as aggressively and as quickly as possible. And they were limited by the statutes governing civil service laws and the contract that federal employees have with the federal government. And so they found this not a loophole, but just the easiest place to cut were these probationary employees, which are the younger employees. An additional thing to know about probationary employees is that when you get a promotion in the federal government, if you're like doing really good at your job and you're a high performer, you get a promotion, you are on probation for the next 12 months, is it? 12 months. And so this mechanism was negative selection. You were firing your youngest employees and your highest performers who had just been promoted, because to them, they were just trying to fire as many people as possible to reduce the size of the federal workforce. And so we can argue about the optimal size of the federal workforce, but we think at IFP, the main problems around state capacity, like how can the government efficiently and effectively achieve its goals, the question should be much more about like, how can we make the federal government on the margin look more like private sector hiring, recruitment, retention, and promotion? Like, how can you get to a situation where you're doing much more pay for performance, you're giving hiring managers more discretion around who they hire so they can really bring in the right experts for the problems they're facing, and how are you able to fire poor performers? Like, imagine if you were the CEO of a private sector company and you were almost completely unable to fire poor performers, and you weren't able to give big bonuses and promotions to your best performers. That would obviously hamper your ability to run the company effectively and to grow and to achieve your goals. And so there are differences between public sector and private sector. They shouldn't operate exactly the same, but that's the kind of movement we need, not just like, can we slash headcount by 50%?
not to triple down on this point, but I'm going to triple down on this point, but with a positive example. So I spent 2 years in the grid deployment office as a civil servant, and the grid deployment office was 50% folks who had worked in the federal government for more than 15 years and 50% folks who had worked in the government for less than 5 years. It was wild. I mean, jaws dropped when they heard these stats. And one of the reasons was because of the rules that around hiring, right? That it was easier to hire. And I'm not going to get into the terms direct hire authority, I want to say is one of the phrases. But that is how I came into the federal government so quickly, and how 50% of us did in the grid deployment office. And it created exactly these environments that you're talking about, where folks who hadn't been in the federal government were coming with ideas, and folks who had been in the federal government also understood how things work and what might or might not work forward. But not just about process, but also just the reality of how decisions get made, right? And there's such an important understanding about what it means to make a decision in the public interest compared to a decision in the private sector. And that multi-generational level of experience and sort of diversity of experience was really important for what we were able to get done. But one of the other, so that's my positive story about it is both a problem but an opportunity, and we've sort of seen the gains that can happen.
Hear that. Students in the audience.
In fact, when I took the job, one of the phrases that they said about the grid deployment office is that it was a startup in the government, which is really interesting because I had worked at a startup company, and my experience with a startup company is that you are small and you have no money, but you also have no rules. Right? And so you were just figuring it out. But a startup in the federal government has a lot of money and a lot of rules. And so it's just a very different mindset about what it means to be a startup. But yet we still had that nimbleness. We just had slightly different processes than when we were going after venture capital. But the other thing that I'll say about that I think we are that gets in the way of sort of an abundant mindset and abundant outcomes goes back to that process question and what kind of outcomes we're looking for, right? Because change is hard. And I get that change is hard for all of us. And one of the things that we've seen changing is energy demand. And that is coming largely from AI and data centers, right? So AI is changing the way people work, right? It's changing the way folks communicate, and it's certainly challenging the grid. And so what we see in a lot of state level policies is this sort of stop, just like when we think about building infrastructure, right? When we saw environmental impacts, right, in the 60s and 70s, and we turned everything into process and the no, right? Presume a no instead of try to get to yes. But when I think about AI, and we know what it can do for growth, we know what it can do for innovation. Actually, we might not know yet what it can do for innovation, right? There's a lot more that it could do for innovation, but we need to enable that to happen. And so instead of a no, how can you get to yes on AI without everyone paying an extraordinary amount of money on their electricity bills, right? Like, what does that mean? And I think in this case, the Trump administration has done some really interesting things, right? And so the Secretary Wright, the Secretary of Energy, wrote a letter to FERC proposing a rulemaking. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the group of 5 commissioners that regulates how electricity system and the natural gas system gets built in the country, and proposed a rulemaking that would create flexibility in how data centers are able to connect to the grid. And then we have state regulators and state legislators who are looking at ways to create rates differently so that you can still get that infrastructure. You can still build the transmission that is going to ultimately give us this energy growth without this fear that we are paying for everything and someone else is getting the outcomes, right? We can rethink all of this. We can do this benefit cost analysis. But when we start with stop no, that can be the end of the sentence instead of a comma that leads us to these innovations that come to abundance.
Okay, thanks. I want to turn to talk a little bit about critiques of abundance as an idea. Sorry, I've got a cold. Stop my drippy nose. So there's lots of different kinds of critiques of abundance. So I'll just hit a couple. One is there a conflict between generating abundance and helping the poor, sharing prosperity, and making the world just? Another is abundance a diversion from the real problems of the country, for example, inequality and nativism? So how do you think about those questions of, are we just focusing on the wrong thing when we're advocating for abundance?
I'm happy to go.
Sure.
Yeah. So are we distracted from the real problems? You said inequality and nativism, I believe.
Yeah.
Some people might say those are the real problems. Does abundance address it? I think that among the abundance community, I would say like the most common issues people work on by far, number one is housing abundance, then energy infrastructure, energy abundance, and then transportation is a pretty big area. But in the community, there is agreement that, especially among skilled legal immigration, this is a thing. This is a supply side reform, right? Like, how do you reduce the cost of healthcare? A great way to do it is to bring in more doctors and nurses to increase the supply of healthcare professionals to lower the cost to consumers and patients. And so I think the abundance community is unified in supporting immigration, and would say that like nativism is a net negative. Nativism is a part of like this zero-sum thinking mindset that abundance is trying to push back against, saying that like my loss is not your gain and vice versa. It's actually that through economic growth and increased efficiency, we can create a larger pie that can be shared. And so when the immigrant comes into the country, yes, that's increased demand for houses and other goods and services, but also those immigrants are workers. And often they're skilled workers in industries where we have shortages and desperately need more labor supply. And so they can be part of the affordability solution, not a part of the affordability problem. And then in terms of inequality, I think this is probably actually a real disagreement between abundance folks and more progressive left-wing folks, especially. Abundance folks would tend to focus on absolute levels of material well-being, whether that's like absolute levels of wealth or consumption or annual income. And more progressive-oriented people are focused on relative rankings, so relative inequality, relative income inequality, or wealth inequality. I think a common position among abundance folks would be that a lot of these policies that are focused on bringing down the top actually don't benefit people at the bottom. It more often, so like, for example, we don't work on tax policy, but California is considering this tax on billionaires. I'm probably opening a can of worms here. But like the billionaires are moving and leaving California. Is this going to actually improve the lives of people in the bottom of the rung? And I know this is like a hotly contested debate. But I think like that would be a classic schism between on the center left abundance folks and progressive folks.
I'll add an example for energy, obviously. So I don't know if folks are familiar with something called, lots of different ways to pronounce it, Jevons paradox, Jevons paradox. So this says that when we increase the efficiency of something, there is then efficiency leading to less use, right? We then have a rebound effect where you actually end up with more use. So folks in the transportation sector are probably most familiar with this. When you add a lane to a highway, you decrease traffic for a period of time and then traffic rebounds. But this also exists in the energy world, but with a slightly different frame to it, right? Where when you have energy efficient appliances, right? When you have energy efficient homes, you have this decreased energy use, and that is good because it is decreasing costs, right? And then you have the rebound effect, and that energy goes right back up. And so the reason I bring this up in this context is because when we think about inequality, right? And we think about, energy efficiency is often a tool that is used to address things like inequality, right? Because you are lowering bills, and that's really positive. But since you have this rebound effect, you also need abundance, right? Like these are partners together in how you think about what your real outcomes are. Is your outcome energy efficiency, or is your outcome everybody can afford energy, right? And if you have energy abundance with efficiency regulations, right, then you are moving everybody up at the same time. And all those folks are also having more thriving and prosperous lives, right? Because that energy efficiency, unlike the traffic example, that energy efficiency is improving your life, right? Your home efficiency, right? If you've ever been in a poorly insulated home, it is not just that it is cold, it is that you can't get it hot, right? And you can do that, you can get it hot once you have an energy efficient home, and then you can use that energy for other things that are also improving your life.
Can I answer in a really non-scientific way?
Please.
So I think a little bit about abundance, like when I really just break it down, it's vibes. It's a framework. It's a framework. It's a thinking about how you want to live with the peeps that you live with, right? I mean, that sounds a little silly, but zero-sum game is a real thing. and you can play it. And it's sometimes fun, like board games, that could be fun. Zero-sum games are real, like someone loses. And I think there's a little bit about a cultural, we're in a cultural moment where so much is partisan, so much is tribal, so much is beliefs in things that are like guttural. And I think we need to, and I really do, again, I mean, I sound a little bit like a broken record, but I think that if you don't want to be part of a zero-sum game, then you have to bring forth the vibes and the values and the idea that you're going to make a contribution. And when you look at localities, you know, when you look at your neighbors, and when you look at, you know, we're traveling, we're here from New York, and we were stuck on a plane that went in the wrong direction. And, you know, everybody on the plane, we didn't know each other, but we were all kind of interested in each other and interested in what the right answer to the problem was, and a little bit complainy, but also, and it's like abundance is about like, what is the world you want to live in? And what role do you want to play in the discourse? Because I think it's not much more complicated than that in some ways.
Yeah, I think over the course of this conversation and the one that we had in December, this issue of zero-sum game has come up repeatedly, right? So a zero-sum game is one in which if I win, you lose, or if you win, I lose. Abundance the idea is effectively the opposite, that there are ways in which we can all win, and that we should be identifying the policies in which we can prosper and produce the material resources and other resources that allow us to all win. So I want to switch to politics. So it's 2026. We are heading into the midterm elections in Congress. So all of our House members and a third of our senators, roughly speaking, will be turned over or potentially turned over. And we're already seeing potential presidential candidates, including Governor Gavin Newsom, start to put out ideas that might form the basis of their presidential campaigns. So I want to ask, is the abundance movement good policy, good politics, or both? Is abundance popular? And if it's good policy but bad politics, how should we move forward?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely good policy. We are a pro-abundance think tank in DC. It's definitely good policy. Is it good politics? When the abundance book first came out, I had a take that I would share at DC happy hours. Like, this is a book just for policy wonks. This is not an agenda that a public platform that politicians can run on. Then I was chatting with David Shore, who's a big Democratic pollster, and he was like, Alec, you have it all wrong. Affordability is the most important issue in terms of what we poll voters. We ask them, what issues do you care about because of the high inflation we've had since COVID, basically. We've had above target inflation. Voters say affordability, gas prices, grocery bills, cost of housing, cost of healthcare, cost of education. These are the most important pocketbook issues, and abundance can be an answer to that. And so I think if you were to do, I'm very confident, if you were to do like a word cloud analysis of politicians on the campaign trail this cycle, affordability would be the single most common word on both sides of the aisle. It's like Mikey Sherrill, who just won the governor's race in New Jersey. She was talking about affordability all the time. I think the challenge is abundance means to achieve affordable ends are not the most persuasive to voters, right? So we're going to build a bunch more housing. And then in 5 to 10 years, once we get all that supply online, your rents are going to start coming down. Voters aren't that patient. Most voters in big cities, they'd rather hear, we're going to freeze the rent, like Mom Donnie in New York. So how do you square that circle? Or Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey, she promised to freeze electricity rates. She didn't promise we're going to lower your electricity bills by building a much more energy infrastructure, electricity generation, more supply. She said, we're going to freeze the rates. And then economists would tell you that's a bad idea. That's how you get shortages and blackouts and brownouts. So you have this tension that I think is very difficult to tease out. And I think it's an open question how it plays out going forward.
Can I just add on to something that you just said, which is like long game policies are so hard politically. Like to make a choice that isn't going to be an instant gratification choice or isn't going to allow credit or deficit assumption, right, It's hard, but that is what this is about, right? And some of the biggest problems are long game problems. And so I'm going to go back to where I started with, which is with Mr. Volcker, who worked for 3 different presidents of different political affiliations and played a very long game with the interest rates and got bricks thrown at his house. I mean, like we're talking, like it was painful, and people hated him, and he was vilified, and now he is heralded. And so I think that part of what this concept is, again, I say it's a frame, is that you're building something that may not happen this instant, but that it's part of a culture that we believe in are working toward. And, progress, what is it?
Progress is a policy choice.
Progress is a policy choice. That's what we're talking about. And it's not instant gratification.
Yeah, I think I know we're going to have to get to the Q&A. I get the 1-minute sign here. So one of the things I want to say about this conversation is before when we were having a conversation down below, I was talking with one of the faculty members. We were talking about California's budget deficit, and I said, "Well, look, we have a budget deficit, true, but we really do. If we cut back things, we have to really be careful not to cut back the things that are long-term investments." And so there's conversations about the high-speed rail, there's conversations about water infrastructure. And I'm coming back to one of the points you said. I'm not necessarily sure that they're great ideas. I don't know if they pass a bit of a cost test, but that's exactly the question we should be answering. And we should be answering whether, on objective grounds, they are going to make us have lower affordability because they free up supply. They free up supply of transportation. They free up supply of water. And ultimately, we need to be thinking in these long-term terms, even if it's short-term costly, because eventually they produce more affordability. And I think, coming back to the point you were making, Alec, earlier about affordability, it's kind of paradoxical in a way, because right now our inflation rate is what, 2.5%, something like that. It's not that high. Even when it was high after COVID, was kind of supply shocks and maybe a little bit too stimulus perhaps. But in any case, it was short-lived, and it really wasn't the kind of inflation rates that you were talking about that Volcker was dealing with. And so we really haven't had, I would say, an affordability crisis. What people really want is they want better quality of life. And that means that they need to have enough resources that they can themselves prosper, and that requires a supply side response. Okay, so why don't we, Jazz, should I turn it back over to you?
Yes.
There he is. He's behind me. Okay, and we'll open it up to Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much. First, let's give a round of applause to our panel. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for this critical discussion. To me, I kept thinking about the importance of working together, especially as we're on the topic of abundance and being prosperous or thriving as a community. I feel like that's one of my values, and I know that's a lot of values that we hold here at the School of Public Policy. But anyways, with that, we will go ahead and move into our Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions for our panel, please raise your hand, and I'm going to walk the mic over to you. Okay, so feel free to go ahead and raise your hand if you guys have any questions.
In the back.
Where am I holding that? All right. So you 3 had mentioned that instead of just freezing rates for housing or electricity, that we need to start implementing longer, more sustainable solutions for the future. But a large problem with that, like you guys had mentioned, is the people don't like to wait a long time. So what outlets would you guys recommend for actually getting the people to know the science behind, oh, this will help you in the future, you just have to wait, and then be okay with people investing in the city?
So the electricity rates one, I think, is really interesting, because when folks ask me about my thoughts on freezing electricity rates, the the first answer is exactly what Alex said, right? That if all you do is freeze rates, then you have all of these downstream problems of that, right? Because rates are how utilities have money to invest in more infrastructure, and what we need is more infrastructure. And this is where I am not a politician, but I think what a politician should do is, if you are interested in freezing electricity rates because you need to keep costs down for consumers, then there also has to be something for the utility, right? So I'll go back to your question, which is how do we tell people to think about the long term? And I think the answer is you don't. Frankly, you don't, right? I mean, on the whole, right, you're learning about public policy and the kinds of education we do and the work we do in benefit cost analysis. You know, all of that is important work for how we figure out what the policies are. But I don't think it is effective politics for a politician to be explaining to someone, just wait. I don't think that is going to lead to elections. And so what I would hope a politician does if they see a rate freeze as a solution is figure out how you still get that investment in infrastructure, because there are solutions, right? You can design creative policies that says this is short term and utilities, here's how we're going to protect your investments, right? Or here's how we're going to lower your cost of capital. Or here are some other barriers we're going to remove so that other people can also build transmission infrastructure, so then we can still move the power, and overall, maybe the utility doesn't exactly have the same return, but the outcome of energy growth and prosperity for everyone is still there, right? And so I think getting politicians to think about long-term outcomes you can do, but then the policies are then going to be maybe probably paired, right? There's a different sort of creativity. And that's what I would recommend over trying to convince people that it's just going to be pricey for a little while. Well, I don't know if I'd say fault per se, because when things are expensive, right, like how do you make things less expensive, right? And there are long-term solutions and there are short-term solutions. And long-term solutions are infrastructure changes, are policy changes, are regulatory changes, right? Are different ways that you unlock investment and unlock growth. And short-term solutions are social policy, right? And they're just two different types of policy.
Hi, so I am an MPP student. I'm also the TA for a climate change interdisciplinary class on campus. I'm also a contributor and editor for the 5th California Climate Change Assessment. So my question to you specifically is, how do you balance, or I guess propose policy that addresses both climate change and our need to increase access to infrastructure and data centers and the advancement of AI, et cetera?
Yeah, great. We're just going to solve all of the problems right now. This is a really important question, because going back to our zero sum, right, it feels like all of those things are in conflict with each other. And they are certainly in tension with each other. But that doesn't mean that they are in conflict with each other, right? So with the Niskanen Center, we describe ourselves as principled and pragmatic. And those are two things that are in tension with each other all of the time. But every day we make a choice on that line, and in every conversation about where we're going to be principled and where we're going to be pragmatic. And so when I think about what are we handling here? We're handling climate change, we're handling infrastructure growth, we're handling AI, right? So the rules that we have now have giant loopholes, right, that are allowing AI companies not just to build their own fossil fuel infrastructure off the grid, but are allowing them to use things like incredibly inefficient temporary generators to power their data centers. That's a problem, right? That is a failure of policy, and that is far worse in terms of emissions, in terms of efficiency, in terms of the impacts of people who are not going to have, that is far worse in impacts and in cost than getting these data centers on the grid and adding more natural gas infrastructure to the grid, right? And I think when we think about different kinds of energy, and when we think about energy growth, you know, one of the things that has led to, I think, some of the actions under this administration of repealing the endangerment finding, right, of using various regulations to keep coal plants from retiring, is a reaction to the climate change conversation, right? But it doesn't mean we can't identify problems and regulate problems, but we do have to be really honest about the timelines and the impacts, right? And what can we solve it with? And you cannot do it with wind, water, and solar cheaply or on a short timeline, right? That's going to take a long time and an extraordinary amount of money. And so it goes back exactly to the benefit cost analysis problem, right? And so when I think about how we address climate change while also allowing for growth, and that growth has to include data centers and AI infrastructure that doesn't feel to me as a consumer like I should be paying for it, right? Those are just hard decisions. And that is one of the reasons that state capacity is so important. And it is one of the reasons that we have government, right? So we talked a lot about markets, right? And we talk a lot about free markets at Niskanen, right? We really support free markets, but underlying it all, a market still has structure, right? So the freedom is about, and I don't remember the exact phrase you used, but
Limited sensible regulation.
that's exactly it. It's about limited sensible regulation that gets us to where we need to go, right? And so a carbon price is one of those limited sensible regulations that would put pressure on these emissions. But then you use that carbon price, and then you decide, are you going to invest it in innovation, right? Are you also going to add efficiency regulations so that you can move cars and appliances and all these other things, you know, in another direction, right? All of these things are part of a solution. And then the point that I made about rates. So I've given you a arguably word salad, but also the reality is that these are hard and we can do them. They just aren't pretty, right? Like policy is also not pretty. Progress is not pretty. It is hard. When I was talking about habitats, right? That is incredibly fraught, actually, to take a position on whether we are rebuilding habitats or maintaining habitats, right? But we have to be taking these positions and acknowledging that, we are going to have more energy and we are going to be using more natural gas infrastructure, but natural gas infrastructure is also what lowered energy costs for decades in the United States because of the fracking boom, right? And that did have climate change impacts, but it also had material wealth and growth and prosperity impacts in this country. And it gave us an energy independence that we hadn't experienced before. So these things are all in tension, which is not to say that we can't abandon climate change, or that we shouldn't be talking about it. I actually think we need to be talking about it even more. But in the context of how we can do all of these things together and realistic aspects of the time and the cost, right? Because a lot of the climate change conversations, especially in the macro discourse, right? In what reaches the public versus what comes out just in the classes that we're taking is that we must do it fast no matter what the cost is, right? And that is not an analysis. That is someone making a choice, but that is a very extreme trade-off that you're asking for lots of people. And the real trade-offs that we're all living with are a lot harder.
That was a great question. Does anybody else have any more questions? You go here and then I'll go.
Going back to the paradox that you were talking about with increasing abundance, I wanted to ask, how can we increase supply without running into that paradox specifically, like things like real estate?
Yeah, so I think here's where the focus should really be on zoning reform and letting people, property owners, developers, build at higher density on property they already own. In California, you have San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. This is some of the most valuable real estate in the world. These are some of the most wealthy economies. People want to live here. You guys have amazing amenities, amazing natural environment. And so if you just merely permitted people in city centers to build at higher densities, that would lead to more tax revenue, more workers. So they're paying income taxes, payroll taxes, sales taxes. You can get in this that was previously called the growth machine. You can get in the upward cycle of growth leads to better outcomes for people across the board because, again, there's a bigger pie that can be shared to cover shared costs like police services, fire, medical, schools, et cetera. And so this has been a big debate in New York around can Mamdani both freeze the rent and do abundant supply side reform. There's trying to reduce environmental review for building new houses to make that much faster. They're trying to reduce the number of regulations that developers need to go through to build their projects while still being safe. And I'm nervous that developers look at something like freeze the rent and say, how can I invest with the uncertainty of when the freeze the rent will stop if you're capping my returns potentially forever? And New York City already has some version of rent control for publicly owned housing. And that was actually introduced as a temporary measure post-World War II. And the thing with price control policies like rent control is once they're in, they're pretty popular. And the ratchet usually goes the other direction instead of loosening up. And so I would say we have to have the stomach in the Paul Volcker sense of like, let's do the supply side reforms without necessarily trying to sweeten it with a price control like rent control is.
I think we have a question.
Thanks. And maybe this goes to Sara and Alec. Thinking about, I know Paul Volcker probably had a little bit of insulation from getting canned when he decided to increase interest rates, or maybe not, like plot armor, perhaps. But can you think of any politicians right now that understand how to message for the future, where they can somehow stay elected with the idea that there are some costs today that you have to bear, but in the future, the ROI is much greater? Is there anyone that you look at and you say, they got it right? Or isn't there anyone that really knows how to thread the needle on that message? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I do understand what you're asking.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name any names. I am going to make one factual correction, which is that Mr. Volcker, when he was interviewed by President Carter, he said, if you put me in this job, you're probably going to lose the election. And President Carter put him in the job and did lose the election. And many people actually believe that we're still talking about the same issues, just talking about a different decade. And he persevered because he was in, we're having a whole debate about why the Federal Reserve Chair is not in the political space, right? I'm not going to name any names on that front, but I am going to sort of flip this question because I think it relates to some of the other questions. It's not all on the politicians to find that path. I think it's really on us and on people in different kinds of participatory ways that don't just, the voting, yeah, absolutely vote. But the idea that you can engage with your representatives of all different kinds and at all different levels to understand the problems, to understand the different sides of the problem, we can all do that. And so I just want to kind of flip that a little bit. One of the things that we're talking about at the Volcker Alliance, and I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, maybe at the reception you could tell me. We want to engage AmeriCorps alum, folks who AmeriCorps, so folks who spend a year, usually right after college, doing a year of service in the community. And a lot of what AmeriCorps alum describe is being in the community and solving these problems in real time and understanding who to work with and how to work with them, and sort of this thing that we were talking about with expertise and how do you move through problems. Being able to come back in this moment and talk about that experience and talk about it with people who may have ideas. It sounds like from the questions in the room that you all have a lot of ideas in your minds about the way things should be. But just because you think it should be a certain way doesn't mean that that's pragmatic, right? So there's a lot, I think, of dialogue that needs to happen in both directions, and we don't do enough of it. We just don't do enough of it. And I'm hopeful that schools of public service can play a role in not just helping to train future leaders, but in having and encouraging those kinds of conversations with the community. So that may not be a direct answer to your question. Sorry.
I'll take it. I'm willing to bite the bullet and just blame the electorate. I think people have bad intuitions about what good policy looks like and which types of policies will lead to which outcomes. But insofar as it is incumbent upon elected leaders and politicians, I think about if we can roll back in time. I know John Fetterman has, I'm going to use him as an example, has gone through an evolution, changed a lot, and is now known for some very controversial things people have very strong opinions about. But roll back to his first election for the Senate in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman in Pennsylvania supported fracking for natural gas and for oil as a Democrat. And this was like in DC, and for people in the Democratic Party, they were like, you know, Joe Biden didn't support that as the presidential candidate. And he was willing to risk losing Pennsylvania over this because it wasn't like along with party orthodoxy. And so and John Fetterman was in a very competitive Democratic primary. And so in a vacuum, you might say, oh, this is for the Democratic primary in Pennsylvania, like being pro-fracking is a winner at the general election level because it's a pretty moderate purple state. But in a primary, he's going to lose. How was he able to maintain that position at the time? And I think there's something that it's incumbent upon them because there's a bit of a charisma surplus or like vibe surplus, which at the time, you know, John Fetterman, he's this really tall, big guy. He is wears like sweatshirts and like doesn't wear suits and all that sort of stuff. And he was just very popular because people liked his vibe. And that gave him permission and space to take more unorthodox positions in the primary that allowed him to win the general election in a very, very close general election. And so I think policy staffers advising politicians who have the special sauce need to convince them as well that like you should take the positions that are pro-supply side because you already have this advantage of like voters like you, voters trust you. And that is like a very hard to define thing of like why do voters like the vibe of certain politicians. But when you have it, you can deploy that. You can spend that surplus on good policy if you so choose.